not necessarily with the answer.
Chris, one of the biggest mysteries of British politics in 2024 is getting a little bit closer to being solved.
It is, and it's the question that keeps rearing its head. When will the general election be?
And it's not going to be on the 2nd of May because in an interview with the ITV in the West Country on Thursday night, Rishi Sunak said there will not be a general election on the same day as the local mayoral and police and crime commissioner elections, which are happening that day. Now, whether you love or hate speculation about the general election campaign, the fact that there is so much and the way it's been going actually is quite revealing about what's happening in politics. So we will kick off with that on this episode of Newscast.
Newscast. Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the studio.
And it is Chris in Cardiff today because there's a splash of democracy and voting going on here with a new Labour leader being elected on Saturday who will become the new First Minister next week.
And talking of other stories that have occurred today, Michael Gove, the Levelling Up and Community Secretary, unveiled the government's new definition of extremism. And he popped into the Newscast studio earlier to explain what it all means. And I asked him a few other things as well. So we will come to that shortly. But Chris, first of all, people who aren't at Westminster and aren't on political social media the whole time might have not realised just quite the frenzy that was building about the fact that maybe the general election was going to be called for the 2nd of May, which means it was going to be called very soon.
Yeah, so there's been two waves of frenzy about this, both of them predictable, to put it bluntly. Excuse my mild splash of world weariness about this sort of stuff.
Oh, he's had a long day.
So over Christmas, there was a blast of all of this stuff. And you had various folk, particularly Labour folk, coming out and saying the greatest secret in Westminster that no one dare talk about is the election is going to be in May. I think Emily Thornberry of Labour did a fair old amount of this amongst others. And then we had the Prime Minister in an interview with, I think it was the ITV East Midlands region, saying that the working assumption was that the election would be in the second half of the year. He said that in the first couple of days of January. Didn't quite rule out an election in the first 6 months, but the suggestion was it would be in the second half, in the autumn, which is when a lot of the smart money have been for some while. And that then calmed down the, ooh, is the election going to be soon thing for a bit, until the calming down went away and the hullabaloo came back in the last 10 days or so. Why? Because we were approaching the deadline at the tail end of this month, which, had it been passed without a dissolution of Parliament, you couldn't have an election at the beginning of May because there wouldn't be enough time left. So all the hullabaloo started again, a lot of it coming from people who would love an election in May and or love to be able to say the government has bottled it if it doesn't happen in May. In other words, lots of folk within Labour and indeed other opposition parties. And so we arrive at today with the Prime Minister offering a bit more clarification.
Well, let's clarify some of the theories then that have been driving this frenzy of speculation, and it was becoming quite frenzious. First of all, Labour's strategy here of why it was in their interest, and there's a few reasons, isn't there, to tout around this idea of an earlier election than planned.
Yeah, frenzious, that's a good word.
Frenzious. It's not even a real word, but it will be now.
It will be now, and you know what it means when someone says it. So I think that means it should take its place in the firmament of vocabulary. So from Labour's perspective, why would you want to talk up an election now? Well, firstly, if you were Labour, you would want an election now. Why? Because you are a million miles ahead in the opinion polls, and the Conservatives look like, on the face of it, they're in a pretty bleak position. Secondly, you want to demand one now because opposition parties always do all of the time anyway. Thirdly, because there's a fair chance the Prime Minister is not going to call one now for all of the reasons set out already, and therefore you can say when he doesn't that he is a scaredy cat, that he is squatting in Downing Street, all that kind of stuff. Conservatives would make the argument that constitutionally they were elected for a 5-year parliament and that doesn't expire until January of next year. So that's why you have folk, principally in the opposition parties, who've been making that argument. One or two Conservatives privately have been exploring the idea that maybe going earlier is better than going late, the idea being that things might get worse from their perspective. The vast majority of folk I speak to on the government benches, on the Conservative benches, quite a lot of Labour folk privately as well, have always worked on the assumption that it was much, much more likely to be in the autumn, because why, if you were a Prime Minister, would you volunteer to go early when the prospect of winning looks like something of a long shot, and therefore you might be throwing away precious governing months that you would otherwise be entitled to.
Then one of the other theories is that actually it's allies of Rishi Sunak who were promoting the idea of an earlier election as a way to scare Tory MPs into being more disciplined and less critical of him.
Yes, and there's also the theory that says Labour talking up the prospect of an early election also ensures that they and their rank and file are disciplined, because there's a prospect of an election soon. No keener way to try and instill a certain amount of discipline than suggesting that your political battle with your real opponents in other political parties is imminent. In other words, sort of hang together. So, yeah, there are lots of forces that would tempt people, and have been tempting people, my goodness, over the last few weeks, to talk up this prospect, even if its likelihood was always relatively slim. And now, as far as that particular date has been ruled out by the Prime Minister. Cue the next wave of speculation about who knows potential dates later in May or June or July, and then we can restart the whole thing about the autumn and whether it's October, or does he announce that he's going to go and see the King from the conference stage, or blah, blah, blah. So we have seen 2 waves of this so far in 2024, and there'll be more to come.
Basically, you're saying we're going to get one night off from this. And this is how we're spending it.
I mean, it pretty much that. I mean, it will kick the can of speculation a little bit further down the road, and then that can will start fizzing again when there's the prospect of another deadline approaching that would rule out a date in, month X, month Y, month Z. Speculation is the the waft of politics, isn't it? It's there. It is there the whole time. But we should always be, sceptical about why it's happening, or at least open-minded about why people might be in the business of talking up something that may or may not be any more likely to happen as a result of that talking up.
And also, there's just not a huge amount happening in Parliament at the moment. So lots of people have got time on their hands to speculate about this. And politicians love nothing more than guessing about when the election is going to be, either because they think it's really fun or because they're really worried about losing their jobs. Also, my kind of game theory thing about this, and this is me thinking like 2 or 3 steps ahead, is because Keir Starmer is desperate for points of difference from the government, and also any kind of opportunity to attack them. I wonder, will he end up in a situation where he makes some kind of commitment about when he would be calling an election if it was Prime Minister Keir Starmer? And actually, do we have then something on the record from the Labour leader that can be then, he can be held to if he's in Downing Street, so we don't go through this rigmarole ever again?
Yeah.
But it's also hard to see a Prime Minister giving up one of the biggest trump cards they've got, which is calling an election whenever they want.
Totally. And then just to spin back to the here and now in terms of the motivations for talking up an election, if you're an opposition party, it helps to know when the election isn't going to be, because, the flip side of the point you're making is that it is a trump card for a Prime Minister. You can start to back time things to where you are putting most of your chips in private, whereas your opponents have to scatter the chips around the range of possible dates, including realistically stacking quite a lot on the most imminent date in case the government goes early. And that takes money and energy and mental bandwidth, which the governing party, even if it's not actually decided, because why would you necessarily 100% decide potentially a long way out, you can mentally stack your chips in a particular place, and the opposition parties can't do that. So flushing out anything approaching clarity or just more information, which as a result of this wave of speculation they've managed to do, you can then plan around what you then know. And certainly when I speak to folk in government, they do lean again back on that remark, that formulation from January about the working assumption being the second half of the year, which means sort of July onwards, if you take that at the sort of the letter of each and every syllable.
Right, let's look at something that did actually happen today rather than something that isn't happening. The government unveiled its new definition of extremism. This is the definition the government will use for itself when it comes to their dealings with individuals and groups and campaigners. There's a bit of politics here. The government says it's as a response to the increase in extremism and concern around all sorts of issues since the Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October. So they feel that they can sort of own that a bit, or at least own the response to that a bit. But of course, this has come in the week where a big conservative donor has been accused of making some off-colour comments that maybe some people would say are quite extreme in themselves. So it's never simple. And the person who was holding the pen for this new definition of extremism is the Levelling Up Secretary, Michael Gove, because the other part of his department is communities and local government. And he came into the Newscast studio to explain what's been going on. Michael Gove, welcome back to Newscasts.
Hi.
We were talking about flats and rent last time, weren't we? So you get all the thorny issues of our era.
Yes, I mean the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities is, it's sprawling is perhaps the wrong word, but it covers a lot of ground. So everything from leasehold and renters to helping communities to fight extremism, with a big dollop of local government spending in the middle.
Although some people would say the dollop's not big enough for some councils. But that's another episode. Right, let's talk about extremism then. So we've got this new definition. I will take a bit of time to actually read it out just so that we're all on the same page. So extremism is the promotion or advancement of an ideology based on violence, hatred, or intolerance that aims to 1. Negate or destroy the fundamental rights and freedoms of others, or 2. Undermine, overturn, or replace the UK's system of liberal parliamentary democracy and democratic rights, or 3. Intentionally create a permissive environment for others to achieve the results in 1 or 2. Why did we need a new version?
Because the old version was a bit loose and it was more honoured in the breach than the observance. So we had a definition that was arrived at in 2011 and refreshed in 2015. And it's important to stress that this definition is there to help government, to guide government in the organisations that we should engage with and that we should fund. And recent reporting by the media, but also recent reporting by the independent reviewer of Prevent, William Shawcross, showed that there have been occasions where government unwittingly had entertained or given support to organisations that were extremist.
So the old version talked about British values. Was the problem just that those values kind of weren't defined enough? And so what you've done is you've used actual words here to do that.
Yes, we've sought to be more rigorous. And of course, you can have a useful debate about British values, and it was a useful definition in certain respects. But this definition is more precise, and it's drawn from a variety of different conversations with people across the piece, and it's been tested, of course, by lawyers as well, so that we can feel more confident that it will be across government a better guide to whom we should engage with.
I'm always intrigued about the options that you had to reject or the things that you had to compromise on. Are there other words and things you thought about putting in here, but then you didn't?
No, I mean, we had obviously a big debate within and across government about what we should do and how we could take appropriate steps. And also, once we had a definition, how we would make sure that certain organisations were covered by it and others were excluded. But that was a debate about means. Everyone recognised that the end of making sure that we had a better way of policing government contact with organisations was the right thing to do.
And when you say government, is that government at all levels? Does that stretch down to like my local library, which is run by the council?
No, it is purely about national government. Now,
right, okay.
It is the case, once we've said that we think that an organisation crosses the line here, that information and the reasoning behind it can be shared, and then people can be held to account for their own decisions. But a local council can, of course, make its own decision about who it might rent out space to, or whom it might invite to, give evidence to a local council sort of external relations committee, or whatever it might be. But we think that it is helpful to have that definition, and also helpful to have an informed debate about some of the ideologies that are of concern.
Right. Point 3, which is this idea of people who intentionally create a permissive environment for people who say the other points. What is a permissive environment?
Well, it's those who are facilitating, egging on, providing support for the promulgation of hate and actions and words that undermine our democracy. And again, it allows us to apply these limbs in a way which makes sure that we can be legally confident that when we make a decision about government funding or about government engagement, that we have the robustness of something that has been through the legal mill to underpin that.
And yeah, you're going to have this center of excellence in your department, which will be monitoring all these people and individuals and working out whether they meet these criteria to be described as extremist. Will people who find themselves on that list be able to appeal it?
Well, again, any decision by government about whether or not to engage can always be subject to judicial review. But what we propose to do, of course, is to gather evidence, and then in some cases that evidence may be put to organisations to give them an opportunity to comment on it. It may well be the case that an organisation will say, look, our team in charge have completely changed.
So you won't just do it unilaterally, you'll engage with them potentially?
Well, it's again, a case-by-case situation, but we will, of course, make sure that we exercise appropriate due diligence, gather evidence, and if necessary, put particular concerns to organisations in order to allow them to inform us as to whether or not that is still their approach.
I was watching you update MPs in Parliament about this at lunchtime on Thursday, and I noticed you mentioned a few organisations that you think might fall into this category. Why is it okay to name particular organisations before you've done the due diligence?
Because, again, I think it's important for parliamentarians, and it was important to do it in Parliament, to have an understanding of the sorts of organisations that may be in scope, and also at the same time for me to specify the sorts of organisations and the sorts of campaigns that would not be in scope. And again, one of the things about this debate, and I had the opportunity to explain this in the BBC earlier on Thursday, and also in the House of Commons, is there's a particular challenge when it comes to defining Islamism. People sometimes mixed up with Islam, the religion. And it's very important to draw a distinction between Islam, which is a noble faith, a religion of peace, which inspires people to good deeds, to compassion and kindness, and Islamism, which is a very specific ideology linked to the Muslim Brotherhood and its founder, Hassan al-Banna, and its principal ideologue, Said Qutb.
Okay, one of the other things you said on the airwaves this morning was that this is in part a reaction to people's concerns after the 7th of October attacks on Israel. I mean, the things that people are worried about happening in Britain as a result of that are horrible posts on social media and protests that seem to be getting a bit out of hand. What does this do to address those two things?
Well, it's only part of the story. In order to address those sorts of things, we need to work with organisations on the ground. We need to build bottom-up grassroots organisations and civil society groups that are bringing people together. One of the problems has been that government has funded work like that in the past, and sometimes that funding has found its way into the hands of organisations and individuals who are extremist. So at the very least, we need to make sure that the people who we engage with are people who are sincere and committed to doing the right thing. We need to choose our friends wisely. The second thing is also by being clear about the ideology that animates some organisations that traffic in anti-Semitism or foment anti-Muslim hatred. We're all, I hope, better informed as part of that debate about what we should be looking out for and what it is legitimate to challenge as well.
And there's going to be more stuff about countering extremism from the government in the next few weeks.
So Dame Sahara Khan, who's our independent advisor on social cohesion, has a report which we'll be publishing and responding to. John Woodcock, Lord Walney, former Labour MP, has done a report on countering political violence. Again, that will be published with a response. So there is much more to come, yes.
You talked about the people and the causes that aren't in scope for this. And you said, so it was things like people with gender critical views, trans rights, environmental campaigners, Christian groups. Just picking the environment. So if you're an environmentalist or an environmental group and you say climate change is such a massive threat to society, we need a dictatorship so that we can introduce all the measures we need to get to net zero and save the climate. Is that extremist then? Or are you covered because you're an environmental group, or you can't be an extremist?
Well, again, if it was the case that there were active steps that were being taken in order to undermine our democracy, that might be one thing. But simply having a strong and passionate commitment to the environment of the kind that you mentioned, that wouldn't be a problem.
Oh, so calling for a climate dictatorship would be fine?
Well,
just if you acted on it. If you blew something up to get there.
Yes, and if it was part of a sustained ideology which led to the vilification of others and acts which would undermine our democracy. But again, one would have to look at it, because there have been examples in the past of extremist organisations sometimes trying to hijack other more popular causes. So everything would need to be looked at in context. But, I'm not a fan of Just Stop Oil or Extinction Rebellion. But they have a right to their views and to state them, and the way to take them on is to engage in debate.
Has it been tricky for you launching all of this with the shadow of the Tory donations thing hanging over you, this Frank Kester?
Well, I think whatever announcement by any government minister was going to be made in this week, following on from that report and those comments, it would always be difficult for any government minister is understandably going to be asked about it, and the comments are racist, and therefore having to respond to them means that you're dealing with something which is deeply regrettable. And of course, there are some people who've tried to conflate the two. I think it's important to draw a distinction, but I can completely understand why people in the course of an interview about extremism would raise this case.
So the first reports came out in The Guardian on Monday afternoon. Number 10 put out a statement in the Prime Minister's name saying that they were racist. At what point did you conclude that these reported comments were racist?
Well, it seemed
as soon as you saw them, or
it seemed to me pretty clear. I didn't read the whole Guardian report. I just heard the BBC's reporting of it. But yes, and as I mentioned, as I think some listeners might know, the particular reference to shooting had an effect on me because I was targeted by someone who wanted to kill me, and who subsequently killed my friend and colleague David Amos. And so when you hear language of that sort, then it inevitably, particularly given the specific racist element to it, it does have a very disturbing effect.
But how soon after you saw the reports did you say, yeah, this is racist? Because you know what I'm getting at. You're a former political journalist as well. It's like I was getting at the fact that it took Number 10 ages, and there were other people in your party that came out and said it much more quickly. Yeah,
no, I absolutely take that on board, because I think that one of the things that is also important is, as well as being clear, is also being forgiving. So it can sometimes be the case that there'll be people who will say and do very foolish things who, on reflection, realise that they've done something very wrong. And I think that it's important that people should be allowed an element of contrition. And the same thing actually applies, of course, in a different context, with extremism. There are people who've been involved in extremist organisations who've subsequently been on a journey, and I think that we should welcome that and recognise that, as I used to say when I was Justice Secretary, no one should ever be defined by their worst moment.
And we did a very good episode about prisons the other day there, which I will send you the link to so you
Please.
Can listen to in the car on the way home, if you haven't listened to it already. Is it true that there's another donation from Frank Kester to the Conservative Party that's about to be reported or revealed?
I don't know, actually. I don't
know.
know.
You don't have to worry about those things. Were you at PMQs yesterday? Did you see Diane Abbott standing up more than 30 times waiting to be called by the Speaker?
No, I was watching it on the BBC.
And should she have been called?
Well, again, I don't want to criticise the Speaker. I know he's faced a lot of criticism recently. I really like...
You're the one person who doesn't want to criticise.
No, I really like the Speaker. But more than that, you've got to respect the role and the office and the decisions that they make. It's like a referee. Sometimes the referee may make a judgment that you disagree with, but it's more important to respect the fact that he or she is the umpire and the arbiter. More broadly, and point I made earlier, I think Diane's voice should be heard. I mean, obviously it's a matter for the Labour Party, whether or not she has to whip and so on. But she has a very distinguished record as a parliamentarian, and she has raised her voice to campaign for, in particular, greater educational opportunities for disadvantaged children, and therefore I think, her voice is a valuable part of the nation's debate.
Now, last week, Mel Stride was sat in that seat, and he was explaining to me and Chris the concept of the dead bat in the political interview, and now you're going to dead bat these next few questions.
Oh, right.
Bloomberg, the news agency, are reporting today that some cabinet ministers have had conversations about replacing Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister before the election. Have you had a conversation like that?
No.
Have you heard rumours of conversations like that?
Not involving cabinet ministers, no.
Okay. Have you got tickets to go to Glastonbury?
I've never been to the Glastonbury Festival. I visited the town, but I have never been to the festival.
And is that just because you've never got a ticket, or because it just doesn't seem like your thing?
I've never got a ticket. I understand they're quite pricey. If the BBC wanted to invite me,
As a pundit.
as their guest.
You and Zoe Ball. I mean, I'd tune in for that.
No, completely. I would love to do the sort of Sunday night commentary with Zoe Ball or whoever. Would love to.
I mean, the big names this year, because they've just announced the lineup today.
Dua Lipa,
Dua Lipa, yeah. Are you a Dua Lipa fan?
Yes.
Shania Twain.
Oh, that does impress me.
Very good. And of course, Coldplay. But they seem to be there every year.
Yes, I'm not a great Coldplay fan, but Dua Lipa I think is brilliant. I mean, my acquaintance with Dua Lipa is mainly due to my daughter. But Shania Twain, I think I'm probably more her target demographic.
You and Chris Mason both. Well, Michael Gove, thank you very much.
Not at all. I'm glad that we're singing from the same sheet.
No, we're not. I'm completely impartial. I'm just asking the questions. The questions are on the sheet. Your answers are a separate sheet.
Thank you. Thank you for this duet.
That's better. That's better. I can live with that one. Now, Chris, we learned something there from Michael Gove. Well, always you learn more than one thing from Michael Gove, but the main thing I learned was that you and he are both great fans of Shania Twain.
Well, I mean, Michael has great taste in music. That's all I can say. You know, Giddy Up is still. I still think, even though it's more than a year old now, that song. Still one of the best songs of the last 12, 14 months, I think. Let alone all the big hits. Man, I Feel Like a Woman. Oh, it's brilliant that Shania's going to be at Glastonbury.
This is like Radio 2 now, rather than a news podcast. The thing about Glastonbury, though, is like there is always a bit of a political angle. And for me, kind of the best one of the last few years was when Tom Watson was Labour deputy leader. Yeah. And it was the day after the Brexit referendum. And was he spotted at a silent disco at Glasgow?
Yeah, a silent disco, I think, at about 3 o'clock in the morning. There was a photo. I can picture an image. I can't remember if it was a moving image or a still image. I'm sure it was moving, which was captured his moving, with those kind of big headphones on that I think you wear at a silent disco, I must admit. I'm not a aficionado on such things. And he's doing his thing in the middle of the night at this huge moment, not just in British politics, but in kind of contemporary British history. And then was he sort of pictured sort of sheepish and looking not
at the train station the next day, yes.
At the railway station about 4 hours later, trying to work out what on earth it meant for the Labour Party, i.e. massive headache for the party, and who knows, maybe for him that morning literally as well.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, Jeremy Corbyn was the star of Glasgow 2017.
Yeah, totally. And got to, if you like, something that was going on in and around 2017, wasn't there? With, you know, the snap election that had happened then and Jeremy Corbyn losing, but doing far, far better than many people within the Labour movement or the Labour Party, parliamentary Labour Party, and even perhaps the wider electorate anticipated that he would, that he was capturing, at least to a degree, a chunk of the population to such a degree that, you know, he turns up at a festival, which is all about, I guess, escapism and escaping the difficult choices and dilemmas of day-to-day life, etc., etc. And there is a political leader being sung to the heavens, an extraordinary moment.
My theory about Glastonbury is it's like a lot of these things, like in fact a lot of big political events as well, better on the TV than being there.
Yeah, I think you put it in that category alongside the Formula One, and yeah, quite a lot.
Any
of stuff.
political speech ever, right?
What? Because you can turn over halfway through,
like many newscast viewers may have already done and don't even know we're saying this. Right, Chris, safe travels back from Wales and see you soon.
Cheers, see ya, bye.
And thank you very much for tuning into this episode of Newscast. We will be back with another one very soon. Bye.
Newscast
from the BBC.
Sandy and Alan, so great to have you here with us in the studio.
Who are you again?
I'm